Good evening, I'm Ian Hannamansing. Tonight, new year, same fears and frustrations for teachers and students.
It's going to be like wildfire for especially the unvaccinated younger kids.
Back to school anxiety, whether kids are returning to the classroom or not. The balancing act as Omicron changes the rules.
My son loves school. He's telling me that he's scared to go into school because he's afraid he's going to get COVID.
Also tonight, CBC News has learned the Ontario government is discussing new restrictions as cases in ICUs climb. And in Quebec, police shut down protests over the curfew. And the $10,000 thank you after a hockey fan spotted a dangerous-looking mole and sent a warning.
If I ignored that, I wouldn't be here.
This is The National. This long pandemic has now entered its third calendar year, and while we've learned a lot about COVID, Omicron is bringing new worry and new uncertainty, including to families with kids in school. This would normally be a back-to-school week for children right across the country after the winter break. Instead, many families are preparing for another disruption. COVID is surging, and student and staff safety is a growing concern. So return dates have been pushed back just about everywhere. Like the variant, the changes have been coming fast, and that has been leaving some parents scrambling. As Julia Wong explains, it's not only the return date that has them worried.
I think it's very irresponsible that we were informed of these plans so late.
Ravneet Bains is scrambling to come up with a plan for her 5-year-old after learning Thursday that winter break was extended. She isn't alone. Almost all the provinces and territories have pushed back the return to the classroom. Many saying they're using the time to get masks, rapid tests, or air filtration systems to schools.
Kids do participate in community transmission, and really we're trying to pull out all the stops right now to slow things down.
In Saskatchewan, though, no changes. Kids there head back as planned this week. Not everyone thinks they should.
We want to delay the start of school in January enough that school boards can come up with strategies for keeping our children and our staff safe. That's all we're asking for, and it's all falling on deaf ears. It's very frustrating right now.
Also frustrating for some, as cases hit record levels, many provinces are no longer reporting school infection numbers. Ontario, among the latest, now only reporting school closures.
It's going to be like wildfire for especially the unvaccinated younger kids. But if we don't have the numbers, then we can ignore that wildfire, right?
Not knowing, especially worrying for many parents of those young kids.
I almost feel like I'm sending a lamb into slaughter.
I think it's a shame if we cannot collect that data, but I could understand that perhaps at this point, there just isn't enough manpower to be able to do all of the types of contact tracing that we would like.
But even harder for Bains, watching her son cope with learning during a pandemic.
My son loves school. He's telling me that he's scared to go into school because he's afraid he's going to get COVID.
A sentiment no parent wants to hear as the roller coaster for students continues. Julia Wong, CBC News, Edmonton.
Well, let's bring in pediatric infectious disease specialist Dr. Fatima Kakar, who is in Montreal. And as we've heard, some provinces have delayed back to school, but at some point, students will be back in classes. So what sort of advice do you have for parents?
Sure, and I know there's a lot of anxiety out there, so I think the most important thing parents can do right now is to have their child vaccinated. About only 50% of school-age kids right now under the age of 11 have had their first shot. And some of that is just waiting for appointments, but some of that is anxiety. So really, please, if you're waiting to get that appointment, make that appointment. The second thing is really having parents and grandparents in that household have their second and third boosters. It's so vital that those who are vulnerable, who have school-age children, be protected. Third thing is really having a well-fitted mask for your child. And regardless of cost and type of mask, the most important thing is that the mask fits your child's face well. And then the final thing is really having rapid tests available for every child who's going back to school.
And let's talk about vaccinations for a moment. The National Advisory Committee on Immunization, NACI, recommends 8 weeks between the first and second dose for children, but Health Canada allows that second dose 21 days after the first, and so some parents are wondering which should they choose.
Yeah, this is a tough question because there's really very little data to guide this answer. 8 weeks is going to have a more durable response, so kids will be better protected going into March break and the spring months. So in general, 8 weeks is very reasonable. However, if you're in a part of the country where there's a surge in COVID, you can get an appointment within a reasonable time frame lower than the 8-week interval. You have maybe vulnerable people in your household, then it could be reasonable to delay it, but I wouldn't go below 4 to 6 weeks because we still want kids to be protected going into the spring months where COVID is still going to be around.
Lots of tough decisions for parents. Dr. Kakar, thank you.
Thank you.
Nationally, 1 in 5 COVID tests is coming back positive, and without enough tests to go around, those daily case counts no longer capture the scale of the pandemic. The most reliable indicator we have now is COVID cases in the ICU. In Ontario and Quebec, they are rising, with Ontario intensive care admissions up 37% from a week ago, and Quebec up 84%. They're the highest numbers either province has seen in at least 6 months. Officials are watching those numbers closely, and that has prompted discussions in Ontario at the highest levels. Marina von Stackelberg joins us with more. And Marina, as we talk about anxiety around the return to school, for example, what do we know?
The Ontario Cabinet met today, CBC News has learned, to discuss bringing in potentially stricter measures. They're looking at gyms, they're looking at restaurants, in-person dining, and they're also looking at retail. Now, sources tell CBC News that the Ontario Cabinet also discussed when students should return to class, but could not say whether a decision on that has been made. Now, this all comes as doctors in Ontario and Quebec say those huge case counts that we've been seeing are now turning into hospital patients.
The Omicron wave is arriving at hospitals.
I'm working in the hospital. I'm going in every day. I can see that it's a problem, to be quite honest. I see that our beds are filling up. We lack the capacity to care for the patients.
Part of the problem, Omicron is incredibly infectious. Many patients admitted to hospital for other reasons are testing positive for COVID too, which changes how much care they need.
When a patient's admitted to a COVID ward, often you have more staff looking after them. There's more positive protective equipment. You need to clean the room differently. So even if someone isn't very sick with their COVID, if they're admitted for another reason and they're COVID positive, it's still a much bigger burden of care on the healthcare system than if they didn't have COVID at all.
Omicron appears to be less severe than Delta. Vaccines offer a shield against the worst symptoms.
The cases that we've seen in the ICU of late, certainly it seems like the patients have turned around a little bit quicker, which we think is obviously a positive sign.
But the sheer quantity of infections guarantees hospitals will feel an impact.
That small percentage of a massive number of people getting infected still ends up being a lot of people that require health care. And we also have to remember our healthcare system was stretched even before this wave.
As hospitals have started to fill up in Ontario and Quebec, ICUs in other parts of the country are still quiet. But like other waves before, central Canada can be a sign of what's coming.
For those jurisdictions like Saskatchewan, for example, who are saying, it looks like everything's okay, we're just going to watch. Well, by the time you see those hospital numbers and ICU numbers climb, it's already too late.
In Ontario, some doctors say it's not too late to blunt the wave.
There's very little we can do to slow down the spread, but there are some things we can do. And if we do slow down the spread even a little bit, it will give the healthcare system a chance.
So some doctors are hoping restrictions are coming. When will we know more about what Ontario's cabinet discussed tonight?
CBC News has learned that an announcement from the Ontario government could be coming as early as tomorrow. And now, doctors that I spoke to today said these government policy decisions are having a real-time impact in our hospitals. Ian?
Thanks, Marina. Some First Nations communities in Ontario aren't waiting for the province to do more to try to curb the spread of the virus. 33 communities in northeast Ontario have strengthened restrictions as many experience a surge of COVID. Bearskin Lake is in a state of emergency. At least a third of the roughly 400 people there are infected. Many of the communities are fly-in with extremely limited healthcare resources. Local leaders are calling for federal and provincial support. More of Quebec's new restrictions came into effect today, limiting which businesses can be open on Sundays. As Sarah Levitt explains, despite rising COVID cases, some say these measures can do more harm than good.
A quiet Sunday in usually busy downtown Montreal. Stores closed, employees at home. It's the last of Quebec's latest restrictions to go into effect. All businesses deemed non-essential will be closed for at least the first 3 Sundays of January. That includes many grocery stores, but not pharmacies, gas stations, and convenience stores.
I just make sure that I have my groceries before the Sunday.
If there's an emergency, at least we still have the, convenience stores.
A 10 p.m. curfew went into effect on New Year's Eve. Last night, a crowd gathered downtown in defiance. They were outnumbered by Montreal police, and before the march even began, it was over. 57 tickets were handed out, and 1 person was arrested for assaulting a police officer. Also criticizing the curfew, a group of university professors who issued an open letter to the government. They note the negative effects on mental health and the increased risk for people in situations of domestic violence.
We don't have evidence of a significant positive or a beneficial effect of it, but we have evidence of significant harm, mostly on the most vulnerable of our society.
Quebec's health ministry says no study was done following last year's curfew, but says it prevented gatherings from happening and therefore possible COVID transmission.
I think it's kind of distressing to see over 15,000 new cases a day.
Some experts agree with the government's move.
They're looking at the numbers of hospitalization. It was really going up, and the risk that we're saturating the system and that people are not able to be cared for because there may be not enough staff for them. I think that became also a huge acute preoccupation.
One the government hopes is alleviated by these latest measures. Sarah Levitt, CBC News, Montreal.
U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin has tested positive for COVID. He says he'd felt mild symptoms during a home vacation. Austin will quarantine at home over the next 5 days and continue his duties. He'd last met with the president, Joe Biden, on December 21st. That's more than a week before first experiencing symptoms. A Canadian member of the International Olympic Committee, Richard Pound, is telling CBC News that he believes the pandemic won't delay or cancel next month's Winter Games in Beijing.
Unless there's something apocalyptic that happens in the next 3 or 4 weeks, I don't see that as a real threat.
Pound says China has learned from last summer's Olympics in Tokyo. Hundreds of cases were linked to those games. On Friday, Canadian Olympic Committee CEO David Shoemaker told CBC Sports he was worried but confident the games would go ahead as planned. It's been an unusually snowy start to the winter for parts of BC, and another storm has swept up the coast, causing damage, disruption, and possibly 2 deaths.
They were located in the same bedroom. Extremely tragic. It's affected the community already.
A man and woman in West Vancouver were found dead after a tree collapsed on their home. It also damaged power and gas lines, slowing the investigation. High winds led to the cancellation of dozens of ferry crossings between the Lower Mainland and Vancouver Island. The island itself has been battered by snow. At least 3 skiers got lost in the middle of the storm. Search and rescue eventually able to get to some of them despite concern over potential avalanche conditions. And sudden snowfalls complicating the search efforts in Colorado. Crews are looking for 2 people missing and feared dead following a rare December wildfire. As Katie Nicholson shows us, experts say this fire may be a sign of things to come.
Steam and smoke rise from the snow as fire and ice fight it out on land that just days ago was a blazing inferno. Vicious wildfires tore through these suburbs Thursday after months of drought pushed on by hurricane-force winds.
Holy crap!
And as the gusts and flames subsided, a snowstorm moved in. The rubble of nearly 1,000 homes now under 30 centimeters of snow.
It just felt like a punch to the stomach, and this can't be real. It's just so surreal to be able to even fathom everything you own is just gone.
2 people are still missing. One of them, 91-year-old Nadine Turnbull. her granddaughter tried to help her out of her home, but barely managed to escape herself.
They tried to go out the front door with the neighbor. It was engulfed. Check the back door. It was engulfed.
Thousands of people now staring down winter without a place to call home.
Just a few days ago, you were celebrating Christmas at home and hanging your stockings, and now home and hearth have been destroyed, and it's a shock.
Yet another extreme weather event.
We're seeing, outliers happening more frequently, and so at some point you start to wonder whether you can really call them outliers anymore.
For researchers who study the impact of climate change on human health, it's an ominous sign more money is needed to help people adapt.
I think people are starting to realize this is not one-off. We are starting to see that events we never anticipated, things that are truly shocking and very surprising, are going to keep happening, and they're going to get more and more surprising.
If 2022 delivers the same kind of heat last year did, there could be more to come. Katie Nicholson, CBC News, Washington.
In 2021, BC recorded the highest ever number of illicit drug deaths in this province in 1 year. And emerging from that data is a second troubling trend, an increase in drugs contaminated by a new dangerous substance. As Georgie Smythe shows us, advocates say it's yet another sign that illicit drugs need to be regulated.
Jarrett McConnell is a user who tests his drugs before he takes them. The pills in his hand contain fentanyl and another substance, benzodiazepines, also known as benzos.
This here has a percentage of somewhere around 15% fentanyl, 6% benzodiazepine.
Fentanyl is still the main factor in drug fatalities in Canada. Benzos are now making the opioid crisis much worse.
So it is very, very dangerous, and it's very hard to know until you get your stuff tested. So that is what scares me about it most.
Benzos are sedatives legally found in medication like Valium or Xanax, now found in street opioids across the country.
It's consistently changing. We feel like we can't keep up with how quickly new drugs are coming in and out.
Overdosing on opioids laced with benzos is riskier because naloxone, an immediate reversal drug, does not work on benzos. Survival is a waiting game, and it can take an entire day for a person to regain consciousness.
Benzos actually add another level to that because they're not really coming back traditionally how they used to. So you're kind of wondering if they're actually coming back.
Most users do not intend to take benzos. Despite that, more users are encountering them.
I just lost all control of my body.
Even long-time users are having difficulty tolerating their strength.
Your mind is racing, and your body's doing things that you can't control. It's very, very scary, and I thought I might die. Yeah.
This rapid rise in benzos may be a new problem, but harm reduction experts say the answer remains the same. Only a safe, regulated drug supply will eliminate the dangers and save lives. Georgie Smythe, CBC News, Vancouver.
A hockey fan in Seattle is being called a hero for spotting a cancerous mole on the neck of a Vancouver Canucks staffer.
That's the message I want out there is let's celebrate Nadia. Also, let's take care of ourselves.
Up next, how she's being recognized and rewarded for her quick diagnosis. Plus, from the fall of Afghanistan to the riot at the U.S. Capitol, major international stories played out against the backdrop of an ongoing global pandemic in 2021. Our foreign correspondents weigh in on the moments that define the year, and a little later, some truly Canadian ingenuity on a Quebec pond.
Yeah, once you're going, it's fine.
A home-rigged solution for a smoother skate. We're back after this. Archbishop Desmond Tutu's remains were laid to rest today at the high altar of Cape Town's St. George's Cathedral, where he once preached against apartheid rule. It was a private family service. Let's turn now to a story about a simple act that may well have saved a life. It involves that hockey fan with a keen eye and the Vancouver Canucks staffer who got her message. Chris O'Neill-Yates explains.
In October, Nadia Popovich had a great seat at the Seattle Kraken game against the Vancouver Canucks. But it wasn't anything on the ice that caught her attention.
He reached over and the back of the lapel of his jacket kind of came down. And I caught sight of his mole right in front of me.
It was a mole on the neck of Brian Red Hamilton, an equipment manager with the Canucks. Popovich had worked in a cancer clinic. She took a chance, wrote a note on her iPhone, and held it up for Hamilton to read through the glass. She said that the mole could be cancerous and that he should get a doctor to check it out.
I ignored it, to be honest. Like, my first initial reaction was like, okay. I didn't know I had a mole on my neck. I didn't know it even existed.
Hamilton had the team's doctor look at it. Turns out it was a malignant melanoma, and it could be fatal if not caught.
He used 5 years. I'm sure you could give or take a little bit there, but that's a hard pill to swallow.
On New Year's Day, the Canucks tweeted a call out. "We are looking for this incredible person, so I can express my sincerest gratitude."
And then the hockey community did what the hockey community does.
Word spread quickly.
And woke up to my mom's call, and all I hear is, "Nadia, you have no idea what's going on right now."
Hello.
Hi, it's so nice to meet you. Are you okay?
Before yesterday's game, the two met face to face.
My mom wants you to know she loves you, and my sister.
We partnered with the Canucks to find a Kraken fan who was at our home opener.
Then during the game, a surprise. Both teams thanked Popovich and awarded her $10,000 toward medical school.
She saved my life. She didn't take me out of a burning car like the big stories, but she took me out of a slow fire.
I'm really hoping that people will just take a couple extra minutes in the mirror to check themselves out.
A random act of kindness that will never be forgotten. Chris O'Neill-Yates, CBC News, Vancouver.
Nice way to start the year. 2021 saw big world events with the power to alter the course of history. Up next, from the fight against climate change to the storming of the U.S. Capitol, our foreign correspondents weigh in on the stories that shaped a year. Plus, a superstar from one of hockey's greatest ever teams, Mark Messier, talks about leadership on and off the ice.
Now the airport is almost calm, cleaned up, but with the new regime's flags on full display. Afghans are trying to find the heart in Kabul.
That was CBC senior correspondent Susan Ormiston in October, reporting from Kabul after the Taliban took control.
Talib commanders are now politicians, awkwardly. Saif Rehman Saif fought in the war, was arrested by the U.S. and spent 3 years in Bagram, the notorious U.S. prison near Kabul.
Our foreign correspondent showed us some of the pivotal moments of 2021, from tracking the pandemic to that stunning clash on Capitol Hill, and a conference where the very future of our planet was at stake. And joining us now, two of those correspondents. Susan Ormiston is in Washington and Chris Brown in London. Welcome to both of you.
Hi, Ian.
Hi, Ian.
So many big stories that you both covered. And Susan, I know you want to start by talking about being back in Kabul. It's a story that you've covered a lot over the years, but what was different this time around?
Oh gosh, everything. I mean, going into Afghanistan in September, Ian, was like kind of the negative image of the picture that was. I mean, we spent 2 decades, Canadians and allies, trying to prevent exactly what happened, the Taliban back in the presidential palace. In Kandahar, where, you know, our troops rumbled down dangerous roads, the Taliban back in control. I mean, I saw them sitting behind desks at the district center in Panjwai, the place, like a town hall that Canada built. They were behind desks at the police station. It was quite surreal. And what struck me was really still the desperation of so many Afghans begging still to get out in September and October. You know, young women had been in exams in universities. Suddenly they were kicked out of university classes. They're still not back. High schoolers told to stay home. The foreign money that's been pulled out of that country has left those with well-paying jobs with nothing, no income. Health clinics supported by international subsidies are collapsing. We still don't know whether this country can survive. What we do know is that millions of people are going to suffer this winter, Ian.
And Chris, like Susan, you've covered so many stories in the last year, but let's start with you on the stories as you covered the protests against the detention of the Russian opposition leader Alexei Navalny.
Alexei Navalny was perhaps the only opposition person in Russia who said he wanted to defeat Vladimir Putin personally. His supporters took to the streets, and it was at one of those events, I recall quite vividly, we were out and there were perhaps thousands of people in this crowd, and they were all marching to the jail where Navalny was to kind of, make a large protest. And off in the background, of course, we could see lots and lots of Russian security services, but they were far enough away, so we felt it was fine to kind of, do a little bit of a show and tell what was going on. We were recording it, and on the second take, I got this distinct impression as we were doing it, like that something wasn't right. And out of the corner of my eye, I could see this phalanx of men in helmets with batons, almost charging at us. And the thoughts are going through your head as you're still trying to talk. Where it's like, well, they wouldn't dare beat us up. We're Western journalists. We're not doing anything wrong. But maybe they would. And so in the middle of that, we suddenly felt extremely unsafe and just bailed off, almost ran away with the camera rolling.
Chris Brown, CBC News, Moscow.
And, at that moment, nothing happened to us at that particular time. But I can tell you that night and in the days afterwards, hundreds of people were brutally beat up, their families intimidated, in some cases even pulled from their homes. And as we know, in the months that followed, Navalny's entire organization was declared extremist and shut down. And so many of the people that I interviewed in the years that I was in Russia are now gone, forced to flee the country.
Yeah, and you think about how experienced both of you are, Chris, and you kind of know where that line is that shouldn't be crossed when it comes to beating up journalists, as you point out, and clearly, you had the sense that a line would be crossed there. So you had to do what you did and move out of there. And Susan, speaking of lines being crossed, we're coming up to the one-year anniversary of January 6th. I don't even know what to call it, insurrection, protest. You can tell me the word, but I mean, whether it's focusing on that or even just generally politics in the United States, I'm curious about what it's like for you to be in the States covering it over the last few months.
Well, so much has shifted with Biden coming into power and Trump retreating, although he hasn't really retreated, Ian, because on January 6, 2022, in a couple of days, he's going to hold a news conference from Florida. So, never missing an opportunity to stir the pot. And you're going to see a lot of rear view mirror analysis this week about that big event last January 6th. I mean, there's huge investigations going on still. I don't know that Canadians realize them. By the FBI and Department of Justice, over 700 people, 700 have been arrested in the U.S. for that insurrection protest on Capitol Hill. But in people who've studied January 6th and that momentous event in the Capitol here in Washington, some of the most startling conclusions suggest that this wasn't a mob of extremists, right-wing fanatics. These were primarily people with jobs, businesses, professions from nearly all 50 states, some won by Trump, some won by Biden, a wide swath of Americans. And they identify with Stop the Steal, and they believe that Trump's second term was stolen, and guess what? They still do. So the underpinnings of January 6th are still circulating in the U.S., and of course, we'll see what President Trump and President Biden have to say about it in a couple of days.
So I had an hour with you on Cross Country Checkup. I only have 8 or 9 minutes tonight. So let's finish with this, Chris. We have about a minute. You were at the climate conference in Glasgow. A lot of criticism about what didn't happen there. What was it like to be a reporter in the middle of all of that?
I think this politically was a big year for the climate. There was a very high level of engagement globally. It was fueled by crazy headlines like the highest ever temperature in the Arctic of 38 degrees, heat domes, as Canadians well know, in the western part of the country. For me, what stood out about the Glasgow Climate Conference was, there was a lot of debate, a lot of discussion, but there was actually an immense amount of goodwill. I was not at the end very pessimistic or cynical about it. I was particularly moved, in fact, by David Attenborough, the 95-year-old environmentalist, the British environmentalist, really considered a national treasure, delivered one of the most mesmerizing speeches that I've ever heard.
The people alive now are the generation to come. We'll look at this conference and consider one thing. Did that number stop rising and start to drop as a result of commitments made here? There's every reason to believe that the answer can be yes. If working apart, we are a force powerful enough to destabilize our planet, surely working together, we are powerful enough to save it.
And when I look at it, they said going into this, it was going to go up 2.9 degrees over the next 20, 30 years. Now, if all the countries do what they say they're going to do, they could keep it to 1.8. Obviously, it's not the 1.5 target they wanted, and there's a lot of criticism about that. But I think it's hard on balance looking back at it, to say that COP26 wasn't at least a moderate success.
Oh, it's been really interesting looking back at it. Some of the stories each of you covered over the last year. Hope you had a good rest, because who knows what's ahead. Thanks to both of you.
Happy New Year.
He is one of hockey's best ever players, but for Mark Messier, greatness was always about the team.
I recognized very early on that I wasn't the kind of player that could carry a team by myself. I wanted everybody to feel part of it.
Coming up, my conversation with the hockey superstar. Plus, another kind of greatness on ice, rigged with old skis and a hot water tank. We'll be right back.
I'm Jamie Poisson, and tomorrow on CBC's daily news podcast, Front Burner, Canadians have piled on personal debt through many decades of economic shocks. Why one economist thinks it's time to cancel our debts. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.
O'Reilly with an opportunity. They score! The Blues strike first here at Target Field in Minneapolis.
With temperatures around -20 Celsius, Saturday's Winter Classic was the coldest game in NHL history. A sellout crowd of more than 38,000 bundled up for this edition. These outdoor spectacles are meant to honor hockey's roots, turning a frozen pond into fun. St. Louis beat the Minnesota Wild 6-4. And from the Winter Classic to a classic team, the Edmonton Oilers of the 1980s are widely regarded as one of the greatest group of players ever assembled. This fall, one of its superstars, Mark Messier, released a memoir giving us an ice view level of what it was all like. I sat down with him to talk about leadership and lessons that resonate beyond the rink. By any measure, Mark Messier is one of the greatest hockey players ever.
Messier wheels down the right side, over the Islander blue line. Messier moves through the defense, he scores! Oh, did he handle the biscuit?
He was an unstoppable force for one of the NHL's most dominant dynasties, helping the Great One lift 4 Stanley Cups with the Edmonton Oilers, and then winning another after Wayne Gretzky was traded.
Kevin and I are roommates, and we said, well, let's go there and win this one for Gretz, and if he's watching, this one's for you, big guy.
Despite all of that success, Messier may be best known for this moment as captain of the New York Rangers, the guarantee.
This was headlines on all the sports sections in New York. Mark Messier said, we will win Game 6.
With his team facing elimination in the '94 playoffs, Messier guaranteed a win and led the Rangers to its first Stanley Cup in 54 years.
Do you believe it? He said we will win Game 6. He has just picked up the hat trick.
Mark Messier is the only player in NHL history to captain 2 different teams to a Stanley Cup victory, and the league has named its leadership award after him. Now he's writing about it in his memoir, No One Wins Alone. I caught up with Mark Messier near his home in Greenwich, Connecticut. Mark Messier, thank you very much for doing this.
Great to be with you.
Now, lots of people in Canada obviously know who you are, and we just had that little introduction, but just in case there's somebody who doesn't know who Mark Messier is, how would you describe yourself to them?
Oh, that's a great question. I've spent a lifetime trying not to talk about myself, as difficult it is, and here I am writing a book and trying to talk about myself. So, I don't know, curious, passionate, wants to have a good time.
Okay, so you didn't use the word leadership. I thought that would be part of the description, because anytime someone talks about you, obviously Hall of Fame hockey player, but they talk about you as being this great leader. Tell me about that. How did that come about, Mark Messier, leader?
Well, interesting. As a young boy, I had a father who played hockey, so I got an early lesson in hockey on and off the ice and the psychology behind winning through my father, watching him coach and watching him mentor young players at the junior level, and then being around great players, great leaders myself. From the time that I came into the league and to the time I finished, I was very fortunate to be around great people who I learned a lot from.
So famously, you're the only player in the history of the NHL to be a captain of 2 Stanley Cup winning teams, Edmonton and the Rangers, but you were not the captain of the Oilers for quite a while, because Gretzky was. And one of the really interesting things about the book to me is to get your ice level and dressing room level insight into Wayne Gretzky. So I think a lot of people watching, they know he's a great player, they've seen the statistics, but they don't know him the way you know him. What is it that made him great?
Well, I think the God-given talent that he was given, there's no question about it. He was born to be a hockey player in every way. His will to win and to be the best player ever was evident to everybody that was around him and played on the team with him. There very rarely in life can you look at a guy that's 8 days younger than you and use him as an example from leadership perspective. On and off the ice, his focus was unparalleled. He was in a completely different state of mind than I was at 18 years old. And I got the luxury of sitting across the best player on the planet, maybe the best athlete in the last 100 years, for 12 years, and look across at him and watch and learn from him. I would have been a fool not to look at him and take something from him. And he made me a better player, not only from a skill standpoint, but from a preparation, commitment, focus standpoint as well.
Well, enough about him. Let's talk about you some more. I brought this book along. Speaking of leadership, have you read this, Ty Domi's book?
I have read excerpts of it, yes.
Yeah, so I was reading through it the other day, and then early on, he spends 4 or 5 pages of his story talking about you. And I just want to read one of the paragraphs here. So this is Ty Domi saying, "I looked to Messier as an example of what it meant to be a true leader and how I should treat the people around me. I took his words to heart, and I saw his actions as an inspiration for how I could work on my skills, but also," he says, "develop myself into a more well-rounded player. Mark Messier made a lasting difference in my life." And it's not just Ty Domi. Lots of people talk about the impact you had on them as a player, but also as a person. When you hear that, what do you think?
Well, I think for me, myself, I recognized very early on that I wasn't the kind of player that could carry a team by myself. And I knew that if you wanted to win, it was going to be important to have everybody buying into the culture and the vision that's been created by the team and the players themselves. I wanted everybody to feel part of it, no matter what role they played on the team. And everybody has to feel that if anything less than their best is not good enough. And it's the totality of the team effort that really you rely on in order to win, and surrounding yourself with people that are just as focused.
You hear people ask athletes they're welcome to the major league moment. So think back to whether it's 17 years old in the WHA or 18 in the NHL. What was the moment where you thought to yourself, man, I am in the big leagues now?
I remember playing exhibition games in smaller venues around Canada. And then our first National Hockey League game was in Chicago Stadium.
This hockey game tonight about to get underway. Messier playing the left side with
And when they played the national anthem with that organ and the crowd going crazy, we looked at each other. We couldn't hear ourselves think. We looked at each other and said, wow, welcome to the NHL.
Wow. So the game is a lot different than it was before. A lot less fighting than there was before. You were a guy who was a tough, aggressive hockey player. You also say in your book, you talk about one of the sort of moments on the ice was an encounter between you and the Montreal Canadiens Hall of Fame defenseman Larry Robinson. Tough guy, skilled, a little bit bigger than you, a little bit older. and he elbowed you, you got mad, and you held your stick up like you were ready to swing it. And Robinson, you point out in the book, kind of recognized that maybe this is not the time to move in any closer to Mark Messier.
Oh, it looked like an ugly situation was going to develop there, and the officials got in. Well, Messier really threatening.
But you also say in your book that you've thought a lot about that moment, and you wonder, how much would you have done to win? What's the answer to that question?
I think there's been a few moments in my career that I wrestled with that, and it actually frightened me at times because I didn't know where the boundary was for me personally.
Mark Messier's motto is live every day like it's your last, and that's sort of the way he plays. He is such a fierce competitor, and that's how most players in the National Hockey League, I'm sure, perceive Mark Messier, like this guy is way out of control.
How can you give me a penalty because my stick broke? Because he fell down and my stick broke? Is that why? Is that why?
Right or wrong, obviously made some big mistakes in my career that I look back on and cringe. But I guess the era that I grew up in was different than it is now. It's, you know, there was more survival. You had to earn respect on the ice in different ways. The reality is that, you know, I don't know where that limit was, and that's not a good thing, I guess.
So one of the cool things about being an Oiler in those days is you were surrounded not just by superstars, but all of you guys were born in 60, 61, 62. So you grew up together. You were teenagers together. You were in your early 20s together. What was your favorite part of that, or what was a moment where you kind of thought, this is so much fun?
The favorite moment is the journey that began with all of us that first year. Through the year, we became, like you talk about, really good friends, the core group of guys, and Kevin, and then next year Paul came, and Grant, and pretty soon, we were a brotherhood that were on, marching on a journey together, and we knew that, Wayne was going to do special things in his career. There was no doubt about that he was going to win a Stanley Cup at some point. So we all said, we just got to figure out a way to how to chip in and support him, and hopefully we could win a Stanley Cup one day. And sure enough, we were able to go on and win 4 together.
Yeah, and 4 together, but then 5 in all. There was that one more Stanley Cup after Gretzky had been traded. One thing I often hear hockey players talk about, and I think I've heard Wayne Gretzky say this in an interview, is that one of the things you miss when your career is over is just not being in the dressing room anymore, not being part of that team. Do you miss hockey?
Well, I think he's right, and it's an interesting. There's a real kind of euphoric feeling when the final whistle goes and everybody piles on the ice and you lift the Stanley Cup, and then about a week later there's a real lull, and I wouldn't say it's a sadness but it's a little bit of a depressive feeling because you're not going to the dressing room. And what I came to realize really is it's those special moments all year long that make the journey so incredibly rewarding and memorable. And of course, we all remember lifting the Stanley Cup, but it's what Wayne talked about, the dressing room banter, the travel. Those are the things that are part of the journey that you really remember, that are so memorable and make it so worthwhile.
Well, you got a chance to raise the Stanley Cup 6 times, and it's a pretty impressive career. Thank you very much for speaking with us.
Thank you so much.
Well, now from NHL rings to a Quebec pond, and a plan decades in the making.
It's taken us 20 years to figure out how to actually make this happen.
The story behind this when we come back. Behold the Sam Boney, a 60-gallon hot water tank turned ice resurfacer. It was a passion project for one Quebec man, and the story behind this very Canadian scene is our moment.
My wife thought I was crazy hauling down a hot water tank that was beside our house in August. But my neighbor put it on the end of the curb, and I looked at it, and I said, "Does that still work?" And he said, "Yeah, it's getting old. I didn't trust it anymore." I said, "Okay, do you don't mind if I try something out with it?" 60-gallon hot water tank that should be connected to 240, but it's just been cut to and connected to 110. It's connected to an old pair of my atomic skis from the probably the 80s or 90s. We ended up getting it going. It only took us about 4 to 6 hours to build. It will get better with time and as we come up with new things. It's taken us 20 years to figure out how to actually make this happen. It's never perfect, but it's close to. As close as we need to perfect.
So, you know, in his own way, kind of like Mark Messier, he is seeking perfection on ice. They've been building that rink for more than 20 years, I think something like 23 years. And at first they did what people all across the country do with, you know, setting up a rink in their backyard or near their backyard. They just take a hose out. I think they pumped water on it, but it wasn't perfect. So apparently that rig creates nice, smooth, beautiful ice on a Canadian pond. And that's why it was our moment. That is the National for January 2nd, 2022. Good night.